wearing this, and then he looked at me, and he said, it's going to be like Madonna. So I figured he needs glasses or something, but we're going to start off today with a little bit of history with regard to the place of Quebec in Canada. I'm going to use a couple of drivers as we go through this to try to explain the breakthrough that Professor Kopstein just described, and show how we in the NDP intend to form the first NDP government when we face the electorate in the 2015 election. Let me start off by telling you that in the 2 hours that we have together today, or an hour and 45 minutes, I plan to speak for about 25 or 30 of those minutes to you. I always love to reserve, when I go into a university setting, the majority of the time for answering your questions. I find that that's the best part. That's where the really good stuff happens. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll repeat the questions that you asked of me so that they'll go to the whole hall. Et je tiens à vous dire que c'est libre à vous de poser vos questions en français, si vous souhaitez. Évidemment, je les traduirai pour l'ensemble de la foule. But since I'm going to be answering your questions for well over an hour, I'm going to allow myself, so I know a little bit more about the hall, a little bit more in terms of the demographics. How many of you is your high school here in Canada? Okay, large majority, over 90. Parmi vous, combien ont fait des études en immersion, soit au primaire, soit au secondaire? Combien ont fait de l'immersion? Pretty high percentage as well. Okay. That's an important bit of information for me. And it's a bit of a background for what we're going to be discussing today, because I do believe that linguistic issues, and those are one of the issues that I'm going to be talking to you a great deal about today, linguistic issues have formed a lot of our relationships together and have constituted some of the biggest challenges that we've had to face. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. But first, let me start by saying that the reason that I spontaneously accepted Professor Kopstein's kind invitation months ago to come and speak with you here today at the return after the Christmas break was the following. It is my conviction that your generation is having the largest ecological, economic, and social debt in history placed into your backpacks by the current government. My belief is that engaging with you, with your generation, is the only way to make sure that in addition to all the other things that you're already doing to be involved in society, and don't get me wrong, yours is the generation that is the most involved. You'll be working in a community group, you're probably involved in an environmental group of some kind, or maybe working as a volunteer in a soup kitchen. But here's a statistic that might surprise some of you. In the last federal general elections, 65% of 18 to 25-year-olds did not vote. 2 out of 3. For me, that's an alarming statistic. And it's something that I think that my generation of politicians probably has to take part of the blame for. Maybe the way we practice politics has turned you off. It was a smart observation made in one of these meetings out west in Edmonton recently. Someone said, well, do you think it's just possible that because we're so involved in social media and we're starting to get results on the things that we work on, that we don't see you and politics as being that relevant? That's a humbling moment, and I think that there's probably a bit of truth in that. But the decisions that are going to be affecting you for the rest of your life, the economic, the social, and the environmental decisions, are being taken by governments. So in all of the busy lives that you lead and all the time that you have to devote to your studies here and all the other activities that you have, part of my plea today is going to be to try to get you to see that if you don't also find some time for being involved in the political process, properly speaking, that those decisions will continue to be made without you, even though they're going to affect you. Now, I would much prefer, even though Professor Kopstein correctly said I'm not going to try to strike too partisan a note here, I prefer that if you were to be involved in politics, that it would be with us in the NDP. But quite sincerely, if you were to be involved in politics, whether it be with the Liberals, or the Conservatives, or the Greens, my purpose would have been accomplished. Because you'd be involved also in the political process. I said at the beginning that I wanted to look at some of the institutional aspects, see how on the Quebec side this is playing through, and I'm going to talk through two different files at the same time and try to connect them. I'm going to talk about the linguistic file quite a bit, and I'm going to talk about the sustainable development file, because it's on those social issues that we find those connections. So I won't betray the fact that I've made you read the chapters of Vincent Lamb's extraordinary biography of Tommy Douglas. Let me start there and say that there are things in this country that bring us together that can be surprising. The national icon isn't a historic figure. The national icon isn't a sports team. One of the things that keeps us together and helps us identify ourselves and makes us proud is a social program. Now, you read in the chapters the history of Tommy Douglas personally. But what was the essential message there, and why is that relevant to you studying political science? It's that the choices we make are a reflection of us. They influence society, but the only way to make them become real is through political actions. Because of his personal history, what he had suffered as a child, Tommy Douglas, with extraordinary resolve and vision, said he didn't want to live in a country where parents would have to choose between having a sick child seen by a doctor and being able to put food on the table. That's a value-based decision. It's a reflection of fundamental goodness. Now, a lot of the institutions we've put together in Canada over the years are a reflection of us. As you study political science, I'm sure you're going to be exposed to a lot of writings on the American side, so you'll read about some of their institutions. Don't forget, there are strong differences between ours and theirs, not just on things like a social program such as free, universal, public medical care, but there are other institutional differences as well. And some of those differences are not well understood. Let's look at some of the results that we've produced in Canada that are different from the Americans. You'll often read about the difference, but in the United States there's a strong separation between the three different powers: the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. In Canada, I'm in the opposition. I'm facing the government. Mr. Harper is sitting there in front of me. The executive, the cabinet, is sitting right there in Parliament. So it's false to say that we have the same separation of powers. And we often make that mistake when we're describing ourselves here. You'll often hear, this is a mistake no one in this room will ever make, you often hear people say, the government recently adopted legislation. Governments don't adopt laws, parliaments do. And Parliament is both houses, the House of Commons and the Senate. A little bit of holy water sprinkled on it by Her Majesty's representative, the Governor General, and poof, you've got a statute. That's us. Those are things that are historically ours through the British parliamentary system. But sometimes we build on that and we put things in place that are a reflection of us, and they differ considerably. In the United States, like here, there's a decennial census. Every 10 years, when those results are out, the lines get completely redrawn for every single congressional district, and every single one of them has exactly the same number of voters. One person, one vote, fundamental premise of the American system. What was my surprise 2 years ago when debating with a very smart journalist, and I was saying, well, actually, for Quebec within Canada, a little bit like under the Charlottetown Accord model, we have to make sure we don't dilute Quebec's presence federally in its proportion of seats. And the instantaneous answer I got from every single journalist standing in front of me was, one person, one vote. That's a fundamental precept of the democratic system. Not one of them had ever read the Supreme Court of Canada decision in the Saskatchewan reference case. I talked about the case, and one journalist said, send it to me, I want to read it. He read it, he covered it, and he wrote a good paper. You see, the Canadian decision was quite different. We said in the Saskatchewan reference case that the Supreme Court would tolerate differences of up to 25% because of history, language, weather, and geography. We would never have representation in the Arctic if we didn't allow for that sort of differentiation. So the model, the institution, what Canada has put in place as its own institution varies quite a bit from what exists just south of the border. A lot of those institutions are under pressure right now for ideological reasons, and that's one of the differences between our formation, our political party, and the current government. You see, something like the Wheat Board. Now, I'm sure you didn't wake up this morning thinking about the Canadian Wheat Board, but it is another institution that we put in place to give farming families, mostly on the prairies, an even break through the ups and downs and the cycles of the economy, of the weather, of the market. South of the border, they have a different solution. You often see farms go under, you often see multinationals taking over larger and larger spaces. Here, we've tried to keep our farming families able to earn a living. We have another system in Canada where we have marketing boards in areas such as poultry, dairy, eggs. This is what we call la gestion de l'offre, managing the market. This is a Canadian institution. That's on the table right now in the current negotiations for a Pan-Pacific trade agreement. And we're quite concerned about that. We're concerned that last year, when the government sat down with the provinces, they removed over $30 billion of the projected funding for Medicare. Because we think that that can only lead to a two-tier healthcare system in our country. Two-tier healthcare is simply a fancy way of saying poor people won't have access to healthcare. Rich people will. And that's, again, something that we said we didn't want in this country. But that's the inevitable result. It's inexorable. That's the way it will go if we do that type of cut in the funding. So you see, there are differences that are social amongst the parties in this country. There are differences that are economic. But more and more, and I would say that as a social democrat, this is the decisive battle for the coming years, there are more and more differences that are ecological, based on whether or not we can sustain what we're doing. In Quebec, we've had a long history of social programs, caring for each other. One would have thought that it would have been a natural fit for the New Democratic Party, which was the outcropping of the original CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation that's mentioned in the pages that we sent you. One would have thought that that would have been a natural fit with Quebec. But what happened was in the early 1960s, as the NDP was being put together, there was a breach. And this was an interesting part of Canadian political history. Quebec started dividing no longer along the normal left-right axis that you see in all Western countries, where you have a dividing line based on social and economic priorities. We started dividing completely differently on a constitutional model. Now that's an artificial dividing line. But it meant that a lot of social democrats, I can think of Michel Chartrand as a good example, who had been working hard, and English and French social democrats have been working hard in Quebec. They wound up drifting apart as the ones went more and more towards the sovereignty model for Quebec and made that their priority, and the others said, well, actually, we're still with the social democratic model. And that explains Professor Kopstein's remark that I was, in 2008, the first person ever elected for the NDP in a general election in Quebec. Because that split had translated into an absence of support for the social democratic option in the province of Quebec, despite the fact that the Quebec model is resolutely social democratic. That's the paradox. You see, starting about the mid-60s, with the advent of a strong sovereignty movement and the creation in the late 60s out of the ashes of something called the Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance Nationale, you have the creation of the Parti Québécois, with its sovereignty option as the glue that kept its forces together. So, within a large sovereignist tent, you accommodated left and right. Within a large federalist tent, you accommodated left and right. What kept them together was a constitutional option and not a social or an economic option. So within the Liberal Party, which is the federalist option, you had, up until very recently, a former head of the federal Conservatives heading the Liberal Party, and you also have Henri-François Gaudrin, former head of the Quebec NDP. He was one of my cabinet colleagues. In fact, 3 of my Quebec cabinet colleagues had run for the NDP. You had on the sovereignist side the same divide. You had a right-winger like Lucien Chral, and you had very strong left-leaning people like Louis Baudouin and Louise Arel. So again, accommodation of left and right, that started to break apart with Mario Dumont's Action Démocratique du Québec. That breaking apart saw Monsieur Dumont give the following answer when he was constantly asked, are you a sovereignist or a federalist? And he would always say, neither. I have an economic option. That's what I want to talk about. That was new. That started breaking down that divide. The creation of Québec Solidaire, with Amir Kadir and Françoise David as the heads of that. They're both in Quebec City's parliament now. That's a left-wing party, sovereignist, and their option is resolutely left, resolutely social democratic. So they started saying the Parti Québécois didn't represent them enough because the Parti Québécois was too ambivalent with regard to its social and its economic policies. That's part of the definition of what we talk about when we look at the changes that were wrought in 2011 with the election of 59 NDPers. We are part of the breaking down of that division along the artificial axis of sovereignty versus federalism. We started putting on the table an offer, political offer, about 5 years before that 2011 election. It was called the Sherbrooke Declaration, and it looked at some of the long-standing grievances, and it also took a clear-eyed view of the failure of the Meech Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accord. In other words, those were great upheavals in Canadian life that had caused a great deal of division and bad feeling, and nearly led to the breakup of the country in the 1995 referendum. So Jack was very clear about that. We were not talking about a new constitutional now, and we still aren't. But we would look at things like the federal spending power. Now, when you get further and further into your Canadian political science history, you'll understand that the Supreme Court of Canada has often glossed on the original deal of 1867. One of the most important ones is the federal government has this complete spending power, even in areas of exclusive provincial jurisdiction, like health and education. That's always been a sore point for Quebec. So what we said in the Sherbrooke Declaration was, if we're going to recognize Quebec as being different, we'll give Quebec the ability to withdraw from this type of program spending in areas of provincial jurisdiction with full compensation without conditions. That doesn't require constitutional change. But it was the type of thing that resonated well with Quebecers. In the wake of the near disaster of the 1995 referendum, the federal Liberals came up with what they were calling the Clarity Act. They were trying to restate the Supreme Court decision rendered in August of 1998 in a reference case about whether or not Quebec is separate. All that case said, in its essence, was if there's a clear answer to a clear question, there's an obligation to negotiate. That's the essence of that decision. They were trying to restate that. That's always the sticking point as well. We simply restated what had been clear and obvious in the 1980 referendum and the 95 referendum. That as long as everything subjective is clear, the side that wins, wins, and do start the obligation to negotiate. Quite controversial. You hear a lot about that in the spring as well, because there are people who disagree with that fundamentally. But that's one of the things where we were able to break through and to talk to Quebecers and say, look at what Quebec has built. Universal daycare, $7 a day daycare. It's a good system, costs a lot, but it gives families a break. And by the way, just so you know, the economic studies that have been done about the $7 a day daycare prove that it puts more back into the economy by giving families the ability to produce more and to have both parents working and being full partners in the society. There are objective studies that have been done of that. Quebec also has North America's and one of the world's most generous parental leave programs. Again, parents being given the ability to raise a family, to work together on both family and the work front, to conciliate, to put the two together, and to be able to work at both at the same time. So it should have been a normal fit, given that strong social background and those types of programs that Quebec has put together. Very Scandinavian approach in Quebec to social programs. And yet, the NDP was never able to break through until that political offer was put forward, put on the table, and understood. There have been challenges. The best way to illustrate the language challenge is with a smile, and to tell you an anecdote about when we were developing my by-election in 2007, we kept getting these documents prepared for us in Ottawa that had been translated and prepared and put into this stilted French because they were being translated word for word, totally inadapted to the Quebec context. And we said, please don't send any more of that stuff in. We'll start preparing our own documents here in Quebec. And that's what becomes the symbol of what the NDP was able to do, to prepare a case for Quebecers that connected with us. Throughout that, the language file has been one of the most divisive ones in Canada, going back to the 1960s when we started having our first legislation requiring, for example, that everything be bilingual on packaging. You probably never heard this anecdote before, but it was a commonplace complaint at the time. Why am I having French shoved down my throat because my cornflakes box is bilingual? No, it was really the type of thing that you were hearing at the time. So we've gone through a lot. In 1968, we had an Official Languages Act that was supposed to open the way for true bilingualism in Canada. It hasn't really worked because up until a couple of years ago, the Conservatives still named a judge to the Supreme Court of Canada who couldn't even understand a word of French. We think that we're moving them along in the direction where they'll understand that anybody who's coming to the Supreme Court today was in elementary school when the Official Languages Act was adopted. They have no excuse if they've never shown any interest in learning the second official language, just enough to be able to understand it. Then how can they decide on cases that affect the whole of the country? That's the reality. I know that you've already studied a fair bit about multiculturalism. Let me try to put some of that into context for you in the province of Quebec. In the 1960s, there were battles, literally, being waged whether or not immigrants should be required to send their children to French school. These were important issues for the survival of the French language in Quebec, very divisive. Successive governments fell on this issue. The Parti Québécois came in with rules under Bill 101 that were quite stringent, but it showed a willingness to make sure that the playing field was even for everyone. Now, that's still a very complex issue, and it's a very technical one. But the overarching rule is if you're coming to Quebec, because nobody's forced to choose Quebec, you can go wherever you want. If you're immigrating to Quebec, your children will learn French first and foremost. It doesn't stop them from having their home language and learning a whole bunch of others if they want. But for the society, it's been important, and it's worked largely. Unfortunately, we've got a Supreme Court that's got a bit of a tin ear on this particular file, and in the fall of 2010 rendered a strange decision that opened up these passageways into English public school for people who had enough money to pay at least a couple of years in the private sector. And that's going to play tricks on us. That's not helpful. It wasn't helpful either when the Charter of Rights was brought in that the federal government decided that they were going to tinker very directly on these issues. It's always been a sore point, and don't forget the 1982 Constitution was brought in without Quebec's agreement or consent. It still hasn't been signed by Quebec today. That is a festering problem. We can ignore it, but it's still there. You can't have your only majority French province not signing your constitution, and it was brought in despite the rules. And the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional, but it's not illegal. That was the gist of the Supreme Court reference on repatriation. So these are the types of things that have always caused grief within Canada and between Quebec and the rest of Canada. But it's also the type of issue where the NDP has been able to bring in some novelty. We've shown an understanding of these linguistic issues. I went to Quebec City and I made a presentation as the deputy leader of the NDP in favor of maintaining the restrictions with regard to passage into the English sector. You know, when you're meeting when I go into a family in my riding, if I'm in a family from South Asia and I'm talking with the parents, I'll always talk in English because they've learned enough French to deal with their business. But when I talk to their kids, I'm always talking to them in French because they're in French school. And they might go on to McGill, and they more than likely got enough English to continue their studies in whatever language they want. But that's the basis of our society, and it's been a good thing in Canada, and it's removed a lot of tension. Professor Coxine, when he went through the background, mentioned I had worked as a lawyer at the Conseil de la Langue Française, which is the French language advisory body in Quebec City. And after the 1980 referendum, when the yes side, the pro-sovereignty side, had been thumped soundly, we did a study to try to find out why support for sovereignty had suddenly dropped like that. And one of the reasons was Quebecers were feeling so secure on the language front, there was a lot less need, a lot less feeling that they had to start pushing more for sovereignty. So understanding that keeping Quebec very French, respectful of course of minority language rights, but making sure that Quebecers feel that within Canada they can still have their space where they can live in French and work in French, that's something positive for keeping the country together. I fought in both the 1980 referendum, I was already a lawyer in Quebec City, and in the 95 referendum, I was already elected. And I can tell you that my #1 job is to make sure that none of you ever have to go through that fight again. I don't want us to ever see another referendum dividing this country. But part of our job is to make sure that we put our cards on the table, say what rules we would live by if whenever did happen. And again, these are issues that some people can try to inflame and take to their political advantage. But if you understand these linguistic files, and they can be complex, but when you understand the history of them, when you understand that after Manitoba joined Confederation, a government there removed the guarantees for French language in Manitoba. It wasn't until 1979 that the Supreme Court finally ruled in the Forêt case that we were going to get back to bilingual legislation, and then it still took another 4 years of fighting because they resisted every step of the way for them to start the process of translating. Kids in Manitoba used to have to hide their French books on their laps when school inspectors would come into their class. This is the type of change that we've gone through in our society, and it's positive. Understanding this linguistic background is very important. That's why when we look at the notion of multiculturalism, don't look at just the theory. Look at how it's playing out. Quebec is pluricultural. It is intercultural. But there has to be a unifying factor, which is a single language that becomes a common language. And that's what we've been working on for a couple of generations, and it's been working well. And I would dare say that it's one of the reasons why support for sovereignty, strictly speaking, is at a low ebb right now. Because Quebecers feel so comfortable in their own home, and therefore feel that much more comfortable within Canada. Now, before I turn it over to your questions, I wanted to just say this. With regard to sustainable development, we've talked a lot in recent times about what we're doing to ourselves. This sustainable development that we're preaching about, that we're talking about, involves our obligation to assume the costs of what we're doing now. What's happening instead is we're leaving a lot of that for you to pick up in the future. Year over year, we're having the largest debts in Canadian history. That's an economic obligation we're leaving to you. We're exploiting some of our natural resources in a way where we're not including the costs. That's a cleanup that's going to be left for you, and the cost of that's going to be left to you. And on big social issues, whether it's First Nations, where we're still not acting, we're still not moving things forward, or it's leaving you with a huge debt for people who are going to have underfunded pensions. These are all things that are being left to you. And I'll boucler le boucle and come back to the beginning and mention this to you. These are all decisions that are going to affect you for the rest of your life. These are all decisions in which you can have a say. Those of us who have been elected in Ottawa are having our say right now. But I implore you, through your studies, through the information that you're getting from me and from people from all other political parties, to realize one thing, that you can have an influence over that. Look at the young people who were elected with us in 2011. Extraordinary young people who are making their mark in the Canadian Parliament. I want you to do the same thing. Not for me, not for my political party, but for you, for your future, and for the future of the country. Thank you.